Well, welcome back. We're talking about China's trade plans and growing investment in Greece. Let's get back to our panel. And George, I want to get back to Greek perceptions of how it sees its way out of the crisis that it faces. In a column you wrote last month, you wrote, and I'm quoting here, "Since the outbreak of the Greek crisis in October 2009, China has been perceived by some Greek politicians and a significant part of the public as a potential savior." Does Greece now see its future and a way out of its crisis more with countries like China rather than the rest of Europe, or perhaps with both blocs?
Well, the problem in the case of the Greek crisis is that people themselves do not believe that the current bailout might produce some positive results. The problem is that by the end of 2014, the Greek government, the then Greek government, had achieved some great progress in terms of reducing the budget deficit and the current account deficit. Then we had a period of reconsideration for 6 months with the leftist government in power. Now this leftist government landed into reality and attempts to apply some bailout terms. It is difficult. It's certainly difficult not only for the government itself, but also for citizens. But investments like the one which are made by China in the port of Piraeus are a step towards the right direction, because what Greece needs is investments, especially investments coming from other countries. And in that regard, I consider the recent deal in Piraeus as very, very significant. And obviously, as far as China is concerned, it's certainly a lesson to be learned by some of the politicians who had believed that China or could function as a savior in the course of the Greek economy. China is not a deus ex machina which can help Greece. China can contribute to Greek recovery via investments, but the country is not prepared to grant bilateral loans to Greece, and this is a lesson to be certainly learned.
Jiang Shuhui, this is also a region that faces enormous political and security challenges. We know that there is a refugee crisis going on right now, refugees traveling from the Middle East, from North Africa, from West Africa. There is the threat of terrorism as well. Is there a risk that China could become embroiled in these challenges, or can China just come along and say, look, all we're interested is in trade and an economic relationship, the political stuff, the security stuff, that's not our concern?
Well, you are right saying that this area is not so stable. There are some places which are hit by civil wars, terrorist attacks, all kinds of things. But on the whole, I would say that this area is safe. You know, so we cannot say that there is a Syrian war, so China will stop making investment in the area. Well, just look at Afghanistan. There are Chinese investments. Look at these terrible places in such countries as Iraq. There are Chinese investment. So we can see that so where there is sunshine, there is Chinese investment. So China wants to make investment, wants to help develop the local economy.
Linda, when we look at this investment, according to The Diplomat, an online newspaper, Chinese banks are also making pretty considerable loans to Greek ship owners who've agreed to build their ships in China. So that makes this very much a win-win situation, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think anytime you see needed investment funds coming, you're always going to welcome that. And Greece, as well as the rest of Europe, is very much short of investment funds. The recent estimates by the IMF and others is that investment is something like 20% the pre-crisis trend. And so that is going to be something, I think, that's going to be welcome. I think probably the thing with Chinese investment is that Europe has a more relaxed attitude about whether it comes from a state-owned bank or a state financing of some sort. And that's also why it's a bit easier to do deals in Europe than, say, in the US, where the source of funds being coming from the state would raise some questions. But I think also, if you think about building ships in China, that's also a way of transferring the know-how of very considerable experience from Greek ship owners into a higher-end manufacturing for China. And in that sense, that's a good use of outward investment funds. You always want investment to have what we economists call positive spillovers. A knowledge transfer tends to do that. But I suppose if you look at Greece and the high levels of unemployment and the real cuts in wages that people have suffered, I would imagine there's also a desire for more manufacturing to remain in Greece. And that's one of the sources of tension that I mentioned earlier.
And George, how important is the whole idea of privatization and the sale of national assets like the Port of Piraeus to Greece's economic recovery?
Well, let me start by the image of China, which is highly positive in Greece. So as opposed to the stance of the trade unions, which is not related to China, it's related to privatization in general, this investment is seen by the majority of Greek citizens in a positive way. And this is also the case with additional investments which have been made or which can be made in the future. So we should not confuse the stance of the trade unions, which had been very powerful in the past, with what the majority of Greek citizens believe. In that regard, I think that China can benefit a lot, not only in the port of Piraeus, but generally in future investments it seeks to make in the case of Greece. So the majority of Greek citizens have started to realize that without investments coming from foreign countries, it's almost impossible for Greece to get out of the crisis. This needs time. At the beginning of the crisis, there was kind of a sentiment in Greece that privatization might lead Greece to lose national sovereignty, but at the same time we should also bear in mind that Greece is a member of the Eurozone, member of the European Union, and the loss of national sovereignty is not a Greek phenomenon per se, but it's also a case for other Eurozone and European Union countries. So therefore the positive news for Greece is that the majority of citizens start to realize that without foreign investment it's impossible for Greece to go back to the previous decades of maladministration. And foreign investments are a key in order to contribute to recovery, how we call it.
Jiang Shuiyu, what are some of the other projects that China is working on in countries in this region, in the Mediterranean region, as it seeks to try and expand the One Belt, One Road economic plan?
I would say Italy might be the place where China has made lots of investment. And because of time, I can tell you only one typical example. There's a big Italian company making tires called Filali. So China has purchased this company. So I think by the time China purchased the company early last year, it was China's biggest investment in the manufacturing sector all over the world. So that will also create jobs for Italy, and that will be also nice for China. So it's one more case of win-win for China and the foreign countries in Europe or in other parts of the world.
Linda, the Chinese investment in Europe hit $23 billion. That's a record, and that's despite the slowdown at home for China. And we all know that the One Belt, One Road initiative, as Shuiyu has been telling us, is a hugely ambitious project to connect Asia to Europe. Is this the area where China sees the biggest potential for growth?
I think it's certainly one of the areas. Certainly the fact that outward investment has grown and really expanded is actually, I think, related to the domestic slowdown. So one of the big reasons why you have a burst of overseas investments is that Chinese domestic firms are going global. As domestic markets become saturated in some segments, they're seeking overseas opportunities. So as growth at home slows, they're looking for new global markets. And that's one of the reasons why if you take commercial outward investment by big companies, we know about Alibaba, we know about Huawei, if you take those companies on top of state-owned investments, predominantly in energy and resources and commodities and some real assets, that combination actually reflects a maturation of China's economy. When you become a middle-class, middle-income economy like China with a big middle class, you do begin to find net capital flows going outward, and your companies strive to be globally competitive. And if China can achieve that, I think that's going to be the biggest part of the growth engine in the future, because if China produced multinationals that could compete with the best in the world, that's a sign of productivity and technological progress. That kind of advance would be able to lift Chinese growth, not necessarily to make it grow faster, but to make it grow fast enough so that China could become prosperous and overcome the so-called middle income trap, where countries slow down so much when they become middle income, they don't grow any further. So I see China's outward investment in all of these guises as being absolutely critical to its future growth prospects if it wants to have a more balanced growth that's driven by productivity and technology, and less by the old drivers, which we know can't be sustained once a country reaches this stage. And Europe is a key part, I think, of this because of its receptiveness to Chinese investment.